Welcome to Theories and Problems in Visual Art. This is lecture number 1 in the history series, The Idea of Art History. I'm going to introduce all the history lectures in just one slide, and then I'm going to talk about some very general, simple ways to distinguish and define art history as opposed to art theory and art criticism. But I'm going to spend most of my time on this third category, kinds of judgment, because it turns out that in order to tell the differences between history of art, theory of art, criticism of art, it's necessary to ask what we mean in any given case by judgment. So first of all, one slide introduction. These 28 lectures are intended to help think about the survey of world art history, because it's a tradition in art schools and academies to require a class in world art history together with the first year studio, usually called the foundation year. But it's not a tradition to explain why that's done. Why do you need art history along with your first year studio? And it's definitely not a tradition to defend or explain how or why the art history survey is related to art practice. So about halfway through in lecture 14, I'm going to ask the question about art historians, why we art historians even bother to write art history, who are we writing it for, why write it. And at the end of the history lecture series, I have a last lecture considering whether or not art history is in fact necessary or even helpful for studio art practice. So everything in this history lecture series is open for questioning. None of these are resolved subjects. They're all puzzles, both from an artist's point of view and also from an instructor's point of view. So some basic distinctions between art history, art theory, and art criticism. First of all, regarding art theory, you can define art theory as the study of properties of artworks outside or aside from history. So an example of a statement in art theory would be, the Mona Lisa is beautiful. There's no history in that, it's just a statement. An example of a statement in art history would be, the Mona Lisa has been called beautiful since the 16th century. That's a statement which is qualified by an historical context, whereas the art theory takes place outside of history, apart from history somehow. There are several ways to distinguish art history and art criticism. The most basic one is probably this, that art criticism involves judgment, which means that you, the critic, describe and explain what makes the artwork good or bad, brilliant, flawed, and so on. There's a critic named Jason Farago who was once a student at the School of the Art Institute and now writes for the New York Times. And he has an opinion about the Mona Lisa that he put in a recent column. She is, quote, a black hole of anti-art who has turned the museum inside out. That's a judgment, and so he's speaking there as a critic. Art history, on the other hand, is the study of other people's judgments, both contemporary ones, people that Leonardo would have known, people in the distant past, and other art historians, provided that the opinions in question are not the opinions of the historian, because the historian doesn't present him or herself as having opinions. They come out in a different way in the text. So criticism can be distinguished from art history by the presence of judgment. This is a creepy video that I found of an animation of the Mona Lisa. There's a number of them out there. This one particularly creepy because it adds teeth and a tongue. Anyway, so here's an example of a statement in art theory, the Mona Lisa is beautiful. An example of a statement in art history, Europeans have called the Mona Lisa beautiful since the 16th century. And an example of a statement in art criticism, despite what people say, the Mona Lisa is beautiful. So you can do it that way. The difficulty is that you run into problems when you ask yourself what judgment exactly is. How many kinds of judgment are there? Who exercises judgment and how? So on the right here, that's just a really small part of a long list of judgments that I wrote down. I was collecting them for quite a while. Judgments that I heard made about MFA students' artwork that I heard in studio critiques. So let's see, just starting on the left-hand column, about halfway down, almost insulting, Someone's work was called this. It's almost insultingly bad. Boring, bland, dull, painfully dull, unintelligent, stupid, trite, doesn't make sense, has useless additions, and so on. Over on the right column in the middle, corny, that's one that used to be pretty common. Ridiculous, awful, in England, bloomin' awful. No motivation, sexist, silly, too light, too dark, finicky, unstable. Neither accessible to all nor accessible to none. That was a fancy one. So this list went on and on and on. And when I collected these, I had this idea that it would be impossible to understand what judgment was, because judgment is no longer in the 21st century what it once was in art. That is to say, ideas that were driven by just a few concepts, like beautiful, sublime, ugly, things like that. It seems to be completely out of control what counts as judgment. But in philosophy, there are about a half dozen kinds of judgment, more or less, and it can be really helpful to think about those when you hear opinions in the studio about your own work, because it can help to show that actually judgment doesn't come in infinite varieties, but really only in, well, a half dozen, more or less. Okay, so here's a slide with the first 5 out of the 6 that I wanted to name. Starting with the first one, aesthetic judgment on the upper left there. And that's when you say the artwork is beautiful or ugly or sublime. And on the right column, I have some writers whose names are associated with these in case you want to look them up. Kant is the one that's mostly associated with aesthetic judgment because he's the one who defined and codified aesthetics as a field, as a branch of philosophy in the 18th century. And we'll come back to him a number of times in different lectures. The other 3 names there are associated with the interest in what are called minor aesthetic qualities, like dainty and dumpy, all kinds of words like that, which are also aesthetic judgments, but were ignored by Kant. So that first one, aesthetic judgment, is a basic kind of judgment of art, which was prevalent up until the 20th century. And it had a fairly limited vocabulary because it didn't even include minor aesthetic qualities. The second on the left there is a judgment that the work is good or bad, compelling or convincing. That kind of judgment, where you're not using words like beautiful, ugly, and sublime, but you're talking about how captivated you are by the work, and you're calling that good or bad. Is it compelling to you? In other words, do you feel you need to pay attention to it? Is it convincing? Is its rationale persuasive? That kind of judgment is associated with Clement Greenberg, the modernist critic, and there's another name there. Stanley Cavell is also interesting in this regard. Both of them wrote about these words, especially Stanley Cavell on words like compelling. So these are judgments which could have a kind of ethical implication. There could be a moral overtone, undertone to them. They're not simply aesthetic, and they don't use words like beautiful and ugly. They're associated with modernism, that kind of judgment. I find your work compelling, someone would say, as opposed to that's lovely, that's beautiful, that's ugly. The third one, the artwork is interesting. So interesting is an interesting word in the art world because you hear it a lot in critiques, and I think that a fair percentage of the time, maybe even most of the time, if someone tells you that your artwork is interesting, what they really mean is that they haven't figured out what they want to say yet, and maybe they don't want to say too much because maybe they're not that enthusiastic about it. Maybe it's not compelling. Maybe it's just interesting. Interesting is usually a placeholder that people will say while they think of what to say. So it's a kind of a prejudgment, something like that. So it's an important word to listen for, but the reason it's on this list is not that. It's on this list for a different reason. It's associated in particular with Donald Judd and other postmodern writers. Judd, the minimalist sculptor, said at one point that the time has passed when we should be saying that art is beautiful or ugly. We should not use that kind of judgment anymore. We should only say it's interesting. Interesting is a kind of intellectual version or a rational version of compelling, convincing, hypnotic, those kinds of more modernist words. Interesting means that you are engaged and you're going to be thinking about the work and you might be trying to draw some conclusions from it. It's a more intellectual, there's a more intellectual feel to it. And above all, it's a rejection of both the first two of those approaches. So it's associated with also with postmodern writers as in addition to art. The fourth one is a particularly odd one. Here the idea is that if you are a panelist or instructor and you think that you're in a critique and you think your job is to judge, that you should rethink that. And you should consider that maybe the more interesting thing to do is to ask yourself why you felt like judging. So for example, if you're a newspaper critic and you're in an opening or in an exhibition and you see work and you think, oh my God, that's awful, what you should do according to this fourth way of thinking of judgment is you should stop and reflect on the fact that you were about to say that this work is awful. You should try to understand how you were led to that point, how you were educated, what books you've been reading, what art you've been looking at that led you to feel that you wanted to judge. This attitude toward judgment, because that's what it is, it's an attitude toward judgment. The judgment itself is to be questioned and analyzed, not articulated. This attitude toward judgment is associated with the art historian Rosalind Krauss. In a couple of essays at the end of the 70s, she described this and she called it method. It's not a particularly accurate name for it. It should be more like self-questioning or self-interrogation or something like that, because that's the idea, that judgment itself in all three of those forms is something of the past, and it's more important now to be self-reflective, be introspective, be analytical about what you do. And the fifth one here is that the artwork is either worth mentioning or not, and under that category of worth mentioning, the idea is that you can mention anything about the artwork. I suppose all four of these categories would be fine, or anything else. You can be very, very negative or positive. It really doesn't matter because mentioning is all that counts. This idea is the invention of the historian and critic Boris Groys. He calls it phenomenological judgment, and I'm not going to get into that now. You can look that up for yourself if you want, because phenomenology is something we'll do as a philosophic movement. We'll define that later, but that's what he names it, so I put it in there. But what he means is that we're all living in a media-saturated age, and there's an enormous amount of writing about art and an even more enormous amount of art. So it really doesn't matter what anybody says anymore. The only thing that matters is that they say something. So if you're a critic and you go to an opening and you decide to write about artwork, that would be positive. That's fine. If you want to write about it negatively, that's fine too. It doesn't matter because basically it's quite likely that nobody's going to read that, but they are going to notice that you thought it was worth mentioning. So this way of thinking about judgment is that if you write or speak, if you mention artwork, then that is the judgment. And not mentioning it is the worst thing. Groys says that people like Kant think of judgment as plus and minus. Beautiful is good, ugly beautiful is plus, ugly is minus. And Groys says that this kind of judgment is not plus minus, it's plus zero, plus or zero. Plus is just any mention, zero is not mentioning it. This is a pretty cynical, pretty pessimistic way of thinking of things because it goes on the assumption that basically nobody's reading anything, but it has some truth to it. So there are the five in a shorter list. And to them, I just want to add a sixth possibility. This is relatively recent. From more or less 1990 to the present, art critics in particular have preferred a sixth option, and that is to avoid judging, but not in the ways that I was just describing. Instead, they avoid judging by imagining that what an art critic should do is to describe or evoke art. So the notion there is that criticism is relatively powerless to change anything these days, and there isn't really any point in being negative. So many artists are, struggling and getting minimal media recognition, and so what the critic's job is really to do is to point people to exhibitions, and the best way to do that is not by, writing amazing praise or fascinating critique, but by describing the artwork as well as they can and evoking it for someone who might want to take the time to go to the exhibition. And so this is, in a sense, the new kind of visual art criticism, but it also brings art criticism very close to art history, changes the relationship that I was setting out in the beginning. So I'm going to show about 10 slides to end of some information from a couple surveys of art critics to show how this has been happening in the last 30 years or so. There are basically two large surveys of critics. Unfortunately, they're both surveys of North American critics, and it's unfortunate because it would be great if other countries did surveys of their art critics. It hasn't been done yet. The first one is what you see up at the top there, and also here under number 1, in case you want to look it up. It's a PDF, it's online. Columbia Arts Journalism did this survey of the top 200 art critics in the United States, judging not by how popular they were, but by judging by the circulation of the venues that they wrote for, the magazines or the zines or the newspapers that they wrote for. The top 200 in the United States were surveyed. And the more recent one is a survey of 300 art critics that was done by the critic named Mary Louise Schumacher, who's been a critic in Milwaukee for a number of years. And there's the title in case you want to look that up. Incidentally, parenthetically, these surveys suggest another way to distinguish art history from art criticism. You could also do it institutionally or economically. You could say art criticism happens online and in newspapers, and art critics usually have day jobs. And art history happens in universities. It's very professionalized. This way of defining art history and art criticism could also be used to talk about art theory, which mostly happens in universities. And it has the virtue of not trying to describe what the content of the writing is at all. It would be a kind of institutional or economic description. And just before I close this parentheses and go back to the surveys, it's worth mentioning, because it's a curious fact, that if you go to a university as opposed to an art school, you can't learn art criticism. There are no courses on art criticism in universities. What you can get in universities is classes on episodes in the history of art criticism. So you could get, you could take a class, for example, on 19th century French art criticism, that kind of thing. But you can't find classes that will teach you how to be an art critic or to survey contemporary art criticism from a practical point of view. For that, you have to come to art schools and art academies, where you can get classes which are called with names like criticum practicum, practical criticism. And the reason for that is that universities have philosophy departments and art history departments. In other words, art theory and art history are institutionalized in universities, but art criticism is not. So back to the surveys. In the earlier survey, the Columbia University one, they have some really depressing conclusions. First of all, most critics they surveyed were white, 90% of them Caucasian, and I suppose especially depressing if you want to be a critic, the average age was 47 of the critics they surveyed. Very few of them made much money. 55% of them made less than $25,000 a year. Only 4 critics in the United States made more than $85,000. That's the top bar on the right, where you see the little 4 and the little black sliver there. So basically it means they all had day jobs, at least one day job. The second, more recent survey of art criticism by Mary Louise Schumacher shows the same kinds of issues. So her bar graph there shows that 56% of the people she surveyed were freelancers without a contract. So it's not a great career, art criticism. Okay, so to this subject of the decline of judgment, the most important of the questions in the Columbia University Arts Journalism Survey was this one. There were like 100 questions or something, so this is like question 80 something. How much emphasis do you place on the following aspects of criticism is the question. And their answers show how art criticism has changed from judgment toward a kind of art historical description. I'm going to go through these from the top to the bottom. So the most popular answer to that question was, quote, providing an accurate descriptive account. That is, describing, not judging, evoking, pointing people to an exhibition, hoping that the description will let them go there. Remaining neutral, and therefore being very art historical. The second most popular answer was providing, quote, historical and other background information about the works and artists being reviewed. And that is actually a fair description of art history. So that's not a definition of art criticism. If the survey result shows a definition of art criticism, it would be the first bar, not this bar, which is really just saying that art critics also sometimes work like art historians. The third, going down from most to least popular, the third answer was creating a piece of writing with literary value, which I find completely amazing because anybody who writes for a living wants to write well. So it really doesn't help to define art criticism by saying that you want to write well. But a number of very prominent critics, the chief critic for the New York Times, the person, Peter Sheldon, who for years wrote for the New Yorker, have said that they were primarily interested in good writing and it just happened to be about art. So again, not a definition of art criticism. And the two least popular answers, the fourth one from the top, is theorizing, and that is to say, doing art theory. And the very least popular of all of them is rendering a personal judgment or opinion. And so that one at the very bottom, which almost none of the people are really interested in, none of them as a primary goal, is the old idea of art criticism that goes back all the way to the Renaissance and before, and back to Rome and Greece, where there were people who wrote judgments and opinions about works of art. That's been the self-definition of art criticism for centuries, up until sometime around the end of the 20th century, 1990 or so. In Schumacher's survey, here's the analogous question, the corresponding question. And the question is, rank how important the following are to your work. And the third bar shows that judging is relatively unimportant in relation to describing and informing, which are the first two bars. So it's interesting that judgment in criticism is very strong outside the visual arts. There are very strongly judgmental critics in fiction, novels, for example. A novelist can work on their book for a decade and then be attacked in the most personal and vicious way in a fiction review. It's fairly common in reviews of poetry, same thing. Drama criticism, theater criticism can also be really pointed, really vicious. Entire shows have been closed down because of critics' opinions in opera and other arts. But visual art criticism is often different. I'd say that nobody knows exactly why, because there are a number of ways of thinking about this. Some people say it's because since conceptual art, in particular, since the 60s, art has taken on the role of critic. In other words, minimalist art, conceptualist, different kinds of feminism and other kinds of art and language, they are very intellectual, and so they contain, they embody, they imply their own criticism, rendering critics unnecessary. That's one way people think about this. And another one is that since the rise of the art market, art has become money, and so nobody cares what anybody says that it means, and there's a lot of truth to that too. That's another reason. But there are other reasons, and they compete with each other, and basically I don't think there's any consensus opinion about this change in criticism away from judgment and toward a more art historical way of thinking. Criticism can be very strong in undergrad studio critiques, and usually, but by no means always, it's less strong as you go along. So if you go up through the MFA, it's less likely to get critical judgments of your work and more likely to be engaged in what you could just call constructive conversations about your work. There are many exceptions to this, but in general, the farther along you go in art, the less judgment that you're going to get and the more kinds of conversations you'll be engaged in, analyses, interpretations, and so on. You can also get a PhD as an artist. There are PhD programs for artists, and in those, you will probably be treated like a colleague. In other words, you'll be asked, polite questions that can be explored together between you and your soon-to-be peer, like your teacher, to whom you're almost equal at that point. So criticism actually exists a lot in undergraduate critiques, and less as you go along as a general rule, and basically not at all outside of institutions. So as an artist out in the world, at a typical opening, you're going to be handed a glass of cheap white wine and patted on the shoulder and say that's great work, and that's about it. You're not going to get a serious, concerted critical judgments about your work as you will in an art school. So this actually, in a way, undergrad is the very center of criticism. It sometimes can be difficult after you graduate. And people who graduate with MFAs feel this. It can be difficult to find places to get really serious criticism. So, by way of conclusion, I think at first it seems very easy to distinguish art criticism, art theory, and art history. But art criticism has largely given up judgment and has become a lot more like history. These things are very strong in art schools and art departments, but in the outside world they can be absent or unrecognizable. So these are definitely issues that have more to do with academic life than with the art market, the art world, or the world outside academia. But while you're here, they're really important issues to decide for yourself. How you feel judgment should be done, what kinds of judgment you're most interested in, when you think judgment is appropriate, whether or not you're getting enough of it or too little of it, and how a non-judgmental field, supposedly like art history, is related to a judgmental field, supposedly like art criticism. These are all questions. I'm just going to leave them open for now.